Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are currently in Web Room 2, and we're going to be hearing from Dr. Amy Schrenk in just a minute. Real quick, just a couple things to go over for the Q&A session. After Amy finishes her talk, there should be plenty of time for Q&A and engaging. If you do have questions, please use the Q&A function. You should see at the bottom of your Zoom window a series of buttons, and there's a Q&A function. You can also use the chat, but we prefer the Q&A. I will be monitoring what comes up. You can enter your questions throughout the webinar, and then at the end, I will share those with Amy, and we'll go through it. So that's about it. I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Schrenk.
Thanks, Meg. Hi, everyone. I'm going to just give me a second here and I'll share my screen. Okay, does that look okay?
Looks great.
Great, thank you. Well, as Meg said, my name is Amy Schrenk. I'm a fisheries and aquaculture extension educator with University of Minnesota Sea Grant, and I'm going to talk to you today about cattail and cattail removal for ecosystem enhancement. I work on this project with Daniel Larkin. He's an associate professor at Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. One thing to note about this project is we have just started this MASERC project this summer. So I'll give you a lot of background and introduction, and then I'll show you a little bit of hot off the press results that the crew has been working on over the summer. So first thing to notice, if you look at the slide, the picture here where you can see my arrow is a nearshore zone dominated by hybrid cattail. You can see how dense that is. And to contrast, the other picture with the log is a nearshore zone that's dominated by native vegetation. So we're going to talk about these differences a little bit today and how it affects fish and plant communities. So first, just a review of what a healthy nearshore lake ecosystem looks like. You can see sort of a typical zonation pattern here. You see lots of different types of plants on the shoreline. As you move into the water, you can see in the background here, this plant's topped by sort of brown. Those are bulrush. Bulrush are really important emergent plants in lakes throughout the Great Lakes and also in lakes in Minnesota. So those tend to dominate the nearshore zone in healthy ecosystems. And then as you move out to open water, you can see sort of lots of floating leaf plants, and there's lots of submerged plants out there as well. So this is typical of a healthy nearshore ecosystem in Minnesota. We think of this when we talk about this, we think of this sort of in a linear pattern, right? We might look at this diagram where we see emergent plants in the shallow. Next, we have floating leaf plants, so things like lily pads, and then submerged plants that are fully underwater. And this composes the littoral zone. So the littoral zone is just the area of a lake where the sun reaches the bottom, which allows plants to grow. And we kind of think of it in this linear pattern, but what we see really when we take sort of a duck's eye view, right, from the water surface, is these plants are really interspersed. So you have emergent plants interspersed with floating leaf plants like lily pads, lots of submerged plants in the same area. So it's much more of a mix here. And it provides this heterogeneous, really variable environment that's important for fish. So if you take sort of a fisheye view of this and move down below water even further, you can see here a bunch of minnows swimming through some bulrush stems. Bulrush are really ideal in the submerged part of the environment because schooling species like minnows still have space to swim among these plants. They don't produce a lot of leaf litter year to year, so not a lot of dead bulrush accumulating, and that'll be important in a little bit. And so when you add these floating leaf plants to these stems of these emergents in the underwater environment, fish are really protected from fish predators, but also bird predators. So it's really this diversity of plant forms in the nearshore environment that's important for fish communities. And again, from the fish's perspective, most fish species spend at least some of their lives in this nearshore vegetated zone of lakes. So whether it's spawning, you can see here a picture of a brook stickleback ready to spawn, or larval fish may spend time there. These are two photos of larval fishes. And juvenile game fishes. So this is a juvenile northern pike we've caught in some of these nearshore zones. So really important from a fish perspective throughout the life of most fish species. You have small-bodied fish that spend their entire lives in these nearshore vegetated zones. So think of minnows, right? Remember, we can talk about the word minnow in the English language, which just means small fish. When I say minnow, I'm talking about members of the group Cyprinidae, so actual minnows, which don't get really any bigger than this. And these fish are really important because they form most of the diet for larger game species that humans tend to care more about. So these nearshore vegetated regions are really important for minnow species. And that's the largest component of the forage base for things like smallmouth bass, walleye, of course, that everyone cares about, and yellow perch as well. So important from fish perspective. So what's happening in many of these nearshore zones is they're becoming dominated by an invasive hybrid cattail. So this is sort of an extreme example of what this looks like. You end up with these really, really dense stands of cattail that exclude all this other variety of native plant life that's there in these nearshore zones. So what species are we talking about here? And this can be confusing for folks, so I thought I'd just spell it out at the beginning. We do have native cattail in Minnesota and in the Great Lakes called broadleaf cattail or Typha latifolia. So this is native. It doesn't tend to grow and take over like the hybrid does. We also have a non-native cattail called narrowleaf cattail, Typha angustifolia, probably from Europe, probably came around and came here in the sort of late 1800s. They're hard to tell apart, unless you're looking at them next to each other. The real problem comes when these two species cross and you get the hybrid cattail, which is called Typha ex glauca. That's the species that tends to be a really aggressive invader and can grow in these really sort of homogeneous monoculture stands. So they exclude other plant species. And in some cases, the buildup of the litter, right, the dead cattail can actually terrestrialize the environment. So take something that was once aquatic and becomes more terrestrial. So fish really can't live in that space anymore. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about hybrid cattail. A quick primer on cattail, if you don't know, and if you do, you can just sort of zone out during this part, but Typha is the genera, so the species characteristics, they have wind-dispersed seeds. So I'm sure you've seen those cattail tufts of seeds. You can see that in the picture here. They also reproduce clonally by rhizomes. So that's the sort of root that connects these stems here. And so we will talk about clones, which is really one plant that's reproducing under the sediment via rhizomes. So why is this hybrid so aggressive? The answer usually is attributed to what's called hybrid vigor. So the sort of offspring species of both parents tends to be more tolerant of a broad range of conditions and just sort of survives better than either of those parent species in a certain environment. So for this hybrid in particular, it has a really rapid growth rate. It has a larger stature, so it's just basically taller. And you can see that in this picture here. Also in this photo, so these are 3 normal-sized human women standing up in a wetland or in a nearshore zone of a lake. And you can see here, this is Carex species or sedges in the front, and you can see they easily are taller than these species. And if you look in the background, you see the trees, which is the dark green, but you also see this sort of mid-green. That is a big stand of hybrid cattail that has been over the last 10 years moving across this particular nearshore zone. And you can see it's much, much taller than the vegetation around it and much taller than these humans standing in front of it. So it grows really fast. Let's see here. It also forms larger clones, so bigger, larger clones than either parent species. And because it grows taller and faster, it has more biomass accumulation. So all that dead cattail accumulates more readily. Another good example of what this looks like in the environment, these are 2 researchers working in sort of a native nearshore plant zone. You can see there's bulrush, there's lily pads, probably some coontail in here. You can see, right, where you're going. When you jump into a hybrid cattail stand, it's very, very dense. You're really pushing your way through. It's extremely easy to get lost. And those cattail stems are much, much taller than most humans. So quite different. The hybrid is more tolerant of a wide range of water levels. So we do a lot of water management as humans. And so that's really good for hybrid cattail. They deal really well with managed water systems. And they also prefer nutrient-rich conditions. And we know we do nothing but put nutrients into the environment. And that's also really good for hybrid cattail. So that's why this species does so well. So a little bit of background. There has been quite a bit of work about how Typha or cattail outcompetes native plant communities. So it sequesters nutrients, it even affects greenhouse gases, and there's been quite a bit of research about that. But there are fewer data about how cattail affects biota, other biota, so things like fishes. So that's sort of our starting point for this study. We have done some research comparing fish communities in other regions between a native plant zone and a hybrid cattail zone. And I thought I'd just give you a couple of those background data so you can see what happens when hybrid cattail invades. So we've looked at dissolved oxygen in these communities. So if you look at dissolved oxygen on the y-axis, and of course, oxygen is very important for fish populations, you can see that in cattail stands, so stands dominated by this hybrid cattail, oxygen tends to be lower than in zones dominated by native vegetation. And we have done some preliminary data comparing fish communities between these native and invaded cattail stands. So you can see we have fish abundance here, just how many species did we collect. The blue is in a native vegetation stand in a nearshore zone, and the orange is in a cattail invaded stand. And you can see we did see a lot more fish in native vegetation compared to cattail zones. We also saw more species. So this is sort of the background that formed our ideas for this research project. So we know it affects environmental conditions. We do know it affects fish. What do we do about cattail? And you're probably familiar with the ways we can deal with cattail. We can spray it with herbicide. We can burn it. Both of these are not great for things like larval fishes and amphibians. We harvest it, and we also can mechanically cut it below the water. So there's a lot of techniques that people use to manage cattail. One thing that's important to remember is that given that extent of cattail invasion in many regions, we're not going to get rid of it, right? There's really no chance we're going to like eradicate cattail unless you start with a very small invasion in a certain lake. What we're often looking at is management. How do we control it? How do we deal with it? How do we improve habitat for other species? One thing that has been shown to sort of work is these small scale openings, so mechanical removal of cattail below the water. So when you cut cattail below the water, as you can see these people doing with sort of an underwater weed whacker, people do this with boats as well, it drowns that individual stem. So cattail will still kind of grow in from the side, but that individual stem is dead. And what we've seen is that when cattail is sort of out of the way, you get this regrowth of native plant species, assuming the seed bank is still there, right? These seeds of native plants persist in the sediment for quite a long time. And often when you can just get cattail out of the way, you see native plants return, and you can start building back that heterogeneity of fish habitat, or those different plants that fish prefer. This also increases edge habitat, and that can be beneficial for fish in places where they can't get into the habitat. So if cattail are so dense, fish really can't get in there. You're actually creating a little bit more edge habitat for fish, and this could be seen as beneficial. So we've tried this in some Great Lakes regions, but our goal then is to see if this is going to work in Minnesota lakes as well. So when you sort of zoom out from these little openings to the big picture, you realize that we create openings like this all the time. So for example, in Minnesota lakes, as a landowner, you can get a permit for a 15-foot swath of emergent plant removal from shoreline to open water, so you can get your boat out or so you can access open water. So we're already doing this. And our question is, can you distribute these small scale openings across the landscape, and is that beneficial for plant and fish communities? So our big question, how does small scale mechanical harvesting of cattail stands affect nearshore lake ecosystems? So is this beneficial for plants, and is this beneficial for fishes? So if we talk about our questions, our research questions a little bit more specifically, does cattail removal increase plant diversity and benefit fish communities in nearshore lake ecosystems? This is a picture from a lake in Minnesota, and I can't remember what lake it was photographed, but you can see here, this is a hybrid cattail stand. And this person, removed some of this vegetation for boat access. And what you can see here is you've got lily pads and some native plants growing back. So anecdotally, we see this happening quite a bit. We just want to see how this really looks across the landscape. And more importantly, how this varies across regions. So we might expect in northern lakes, where we have a really intact seed bank, native plants are going to grow up pretty quickly. But what about metro lakes? What about perhaps southern lakes? Is that going to be different regionally across Minnesota? So those are our research questions, kind of a long build up to what we're asking in our project. We have started this project this summer. We have 9 lakes that we've sampled sort of before we remove cattail. So we've got Rainy Lake in Kabetogama in Voyageurs, Beltane first and second crow in central part of Minnesota, Maud, Long Lake, and then Big Marine and Coon Lake down here in the Twin Cities. So those are our sample sites that we're using to test these ideas. And to give you an idea of how this is going to work, I have a sort of imaginary lake here. And at each of these lakes, we're going to select 2 cattail sites. So a cattail retained and a cattail removal site. Each of these sites is going to be 10 meters wide or 30 feet. We chose this because that doubles the current permitted amount. So currently, as I said earlier, you can get a permit to remove 15 feet of emergent vegetation in front of your property. We doubled this to 30 feet just to see if this provided benefits for fish or plant community. So we sampled all these lakes this summer before we removed cattail, and then we will remove cattail this fall and go back next summer and sample these sites again. So just to give you an example, this is one of our sites. We had Kristen Libby come out with a drone, which was awesome, and get some footage of one of our sites. So this is Big Marine. You can see here, this is our cattail stand. You can see our field crew out there. And so we'll take this cattail stand, we'll divide it into 2 sites separated from each other. And then sometime before November, we'll remove cattail at one of these sites and come back and measure it, our variables during the next summer. So I'll show you that timeline in just a minute. We have our sites well marked because what will be happening is we'll be contracting with cattail, folks who remove cattail with their boat gear, and they'll come in and just remove the cattail at one of these sites. So just a big picture of our overall timeline of this project. So summer 2021, so the summer that we just finished, we measured water quality plants and fishes before cattail removal. So we did that at both sites. You can see our cattail removal site is green here because cattail haven't been removed yet. And then in fall 2021, we'll remove cattails at one of these two sites. And again, that's with mechanical cutting below the water. And then we'll go back in summer 2022, measure water quality plants and fish post cattail removal and look at those comparisons. Just to give you a few more details of our methods. So this big green rectangle is actually one of these sites sort of pulled out. At each of these sites, we have 10, you could call them subplots. Here's the shoreline for reference, and here's open water. Remember, these sites are about 30 feet wide. And we'll measure ecosystem variables at each of these subplots. So for example, we have a set of environmental variables here, and you can see this is Mike, one of our grad students, measuring environmental variables in a subplot. We'll look at dissolved oxygen, temperature, conductivity, and pH, and also plant community. So we'll be measuring things like species richness and abundance, and also just sort of community variables, how many of what species are there. So that's the plant data. We will also be measuring fish at each site. So you can see those little rectangles have changed. These are supposed to be examples of minnow traps. We'll be using minnow traps to measure fish. Again, abundance, species richness, species diversity. We use minnow traps to sample fishes and cattail stands. You saw the pictures of how dense it is. It's very difficult to sample fish really in many other ways in a cattail stand. So we've chosen minnow traps. If you don't know what they're like, they look like this. They've got little holes here. The fish swim in, they can't swim out. They're very simple to use and simple to check. One thing that's really important when you're using minnow traps is to leave them out over at least 10 days. So our sampling period for fish is 10 days. Fish are really patchy in the environment, right? You can put out your minnow trap one day and get 0 and another day get 100. So we found that 10 days really allows us to sort of get a good picture of what's there and collect any rare species that might be sort of in the area. So that's how we're collecting fish. And that's what our crews did this past summer. A really important component of this project has been collaboration. You can imagine where we have a large area we're sampling, we needed to select sites. So we've had really strong collaboration with Minnesota DNR. Shane McBride, who's the aquatic plant management specialist, has helped us out with that. Donna Dustin, a fisheries research biologist as well. So that's been really useful. We met with the DNR early on to sort of get their ideas and figure out where they would prefer us to sample, and that's been really helpful. We also have a strong collaboration with Voyageurs National Park, particularly Reed Plum, the biologist up there, who helped us find sites and is actually doing the cattail removal up in Rainy and Cab. So That's also been really valuable collaboration. The most important components of this project are the 2 graduate students who started in June and were thrown right into the lion's den of the field. So we have Brendan Nee, who just were doing the fish work here in the hat, and Mike Tuma, who is behind the cattail doing the plant work. A plug for their poster presentations. So they're going to be presenting posters on the details of their specific parts of this project. So I would really strongly suggest you check out their poster sessions for some of the details. We also had a technician this summer, Kaylin Schmidt. She was great tromping around these cattail areas. She's an undergrad at UMD. So a very few hot off the presses results here. As I said, the crew just finished a really, really rigorous field sampling, and they are in the process of working on the logistics of cattail removal. So I can tell you that they collected 1,740 fishes across our 9 lake sites from June through August. And what you see here in Brendan's hand is a juvenile sunfish. These tend to be quite common within cattail stands. And when we are sort of looked regionally at fish abundance, where they collected their most sort of highest number of species and most individuals, we're actually in these Twin Cities sites and these Western lakes. Remember, we're really not comparing fish regionally. What we're interested in is the removal within each lake, but just kind of an interesting pattern we've seen so far. The other really interesting thing they're finding that we have found before is that what fish are there varies depending on how close you are to the shoreline. And you can imagine this is true. So in a cattail stand, it tends to be, much denser near the shore than it is near open water. So you have occasionally these minnow traps near the open water are maybe a little bit less dense in terms of cattail growth. So you see in these really dense sites, more juvenile sunfish and also mud minnow. The thing to know about mud minnow is they're not actually in the minnow family. They're more related actually to a northern pike, but they are very tolerant of low oxygen. They can actually gulp air when oxygen gets really low. So you find this group of sort of species in these really dense areas, and you only find minnows very, very occasionally in a cattail stand, and they tend to be in the really, really sparse areas. So this is really similar to what we found in Great Lakes ecosystems. So juvenile sunfish dominating in the dense cattail, and we tend to lose minnows in these cattail stands. We see minnows in native vegetation, but not so much in cattail stands. Why do we care about this? One of the things that's important for forage is minnows. So minnows tend to be sort of more in open water. They tend to be in less vegetated areas. They're more available than for predators, right? For game, fish. They also don't have these nasty spines, which are not fun when you're trying to eat other fish. So the sort of extending this out over the longer period of time, if we're losing minnow communities as we get increased invasion of hybrid cattail, this is likely to have an effect on game species. So that's something we're really interested in. We'll of course get a better sense of this when we actually sample our cattail removed sites. So remember, this is just cattail retained. We haven't looked at any removal yet. We'll be interested to note how the fish community changes. Will we see minnows kind of come into these removed sites? And we don't know. We'll have to wait till next year to see about that. So just to wrap up here, what do we suspect our impacts of this project will be? We really hope to understand how cattail removal affects fish communities, and not only just in 1 or 2 lakes, but sort of regionally in Minnesota. We want to determine if these small scale, sort of landowner scale removals can be an effective management strategy and can benefit nearshore lake communities. And if it does seem to be beneficial, this would inform Minnesota DNR to help make landowner permitting decisions. A really important aspect of our project is we don't just want to get the idea out that like, oh yeah, we just got to remove all this cattail, because first of all, that's not going to happen. And second of all, it's really important to have native plant communities. So it's not really cattail eradication that we're talking about. It's more restoration of native plant communities so that you have those different types of plants that are really important for a thriving fish community in a lake. So that's a really important component of our project. Things we might think about in the future after this first couple of years: how long does it take this cattail to regrow? We've seen this picture is about a year after removal. Certainly it's going to grow back in. How long does this take? what maintenance is required to sustain these openings. If you have a sort of initial investment of removing this cattail, can you just sort of monitor, sort of keep mowing the edges a little bit with a weed whacker? What do you have to do to sustain these openings? Maybe rectangles are not the way to go. Maybe circles are better. What other removal configurations might be beneficial for fish communities and plant communities? And there's a really interesting question about muskrats. So we've noticed in the Great Lakes region that every time we open up cattail, all of a sudden these muskrats come in. They like cattail. They use it for all the things they use any other plant species for. So they often kind of maintain some of these openings. So I think that would be a really interesting line of inquiry to look at how muskrats affect hybrid cattail as well. So with that, I want to thank all of our partners and collaborators and the folks who funded our project. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Amy. That was fantastic and really interesting for our attendees here. Over 50 of you. That's awesome. Please, if you have questions, drop them into the Q&A or the chat if you prefer, and I will pass those on to Amy. I guess until folks get their questions submitted, I'll keep my eye on that, but I could lead off with a few. Amy, you had mentioned something, other research about cattail and greenhouse gases. I was really curious about that. You don't have to go into a long explanation, but what's the deal there?
Yeah, so and this is a paper that just came out in some of the Great Lakes work. So there is some interest in whether or not these cattail mats sort of emit methane. When you see all these bubbles coming out of cattail mats, there's some research, and I don't know it as well as the authors do, but that there is increased emission of methane in some of these floating cattail mats. Wow. So, and that's something that they've done. There's a group out of Loyola Chicago who's done a lot of work on plants, soil, nutrients with cattails in the Great Lakes region. So there's some interesting work coming out of there as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's good to know. That maybe at some point when we invest more in climate solutions, we could have a merging of an AIS solution and a climate solution. Okay, yeah. We're getting some questions coming in. I'll start with some audience Q&A. So, great question from Barbara. Very interesting. Thank you. Barbara's wondering, how long are the openings you're making? So we got 30 feet wide, but how long?
Good question. It's going to be really variable. It's going to go shoreline to open water. So one of the important things for fish is access to that open water. And I showed you those dissolved oxygen data that it tends to be lower in cattail stands. And part of the reason we think that is so at night, dissolved oxygen in the water, especially when you have a lot of plants, goes very low because you don't have any more photosynthesis occurring at night, right? So oxygen's getting consumed. It's really low. Even in native vegetation areas in the early morning. We think what's happening in cattail stands is because it's so dense, water is not moving in from sort of more oxygenated regions further out in the lake. So when we designed our study, we wanted to be able to go all the way to open water so that there was water movement into those sort of interior cut stands. So good question. So it'll be variable. One of the things our crew figured out is that there's a lot of variability in lakes and there's a lot of variability in cattail stands. So it'll be important to compare, within lake differences for all these sites.
Great. Another question from Kathleen. How did you choose your lakes for the study sites?
Good question. So we really did that in close collaboration with DNR, as well as Voyageurs National Park. We wanted public land sites that we could access. That was our sort of first characteristic. Second was just sites that were suitable. So one of the really complicated things with cattail, as you probably, some of you, I'm sure most of you know, is they do have a tendency to form these floating mats. And that's like a next question, right? So right now we're looking at rooted cattail stands. I think we will need to look at floating cattail stands as well, but we wanted to stay away from those floating mats. So choosing sites that had the type of cattail we were looking for, as well as access and landowner and public land willingness. So it was really a long process choosing sites logistically.
Okay. Question from Phyllis. Do you see any crossover in these applications with Phragmites management?
It's possible. Phragmites doesn't grow sort of out into the water as much, so we don't always think about it with fish. but I think it could be possible. I know less about Phragmites control than I do about cattail. You know, we think of Phragmites more on land and less deeper into the water. Cattail goes so far into the water, but I think there's possibility there, sure.
Great. Do you know much about the science of cattail harvesting with respect to nutrient management and phosphorus reductions?
I do know that one of the important things when you harvest cattail, if you're going to use mechanical removal of cattail, is you want it away. So there's a couple of applications, and this is not necessarily my field. I'm a fish person by training, but people do use cattail sort of as phosphorus removal in sort of treatment ponds, or you know, it effectively, because it's a growing plant, like any growing plant, removes phosphorus from the environment. On the flip side, if you're going to harvest cattail, you know, for example, in our situation, you want to move it away from the water because it's all that phosphorus that's all stored up in that plant is going to leach back into the water. So you do need to be careful of that when you're harvesting cattail. If you're sort of leaching a bunch of phosphorus back into the water, but it is also useful as a growing plant to remove phosphorus from a system. I think that answered your question. If not, ask it again.
Yeah. Okay. A question about the water quality parameters. Could you remind us which method or which parameters you're looking at, and maybe a little more detail about those in the removal sites versus the control sites?
Yep. So it's really pretty basic, the water quality stuff. It's just, you know, we're looking at temperature, dissolved oxygen, conductivity, which is likely to be very similar, and pH just as background to compare among lakes. The ones that we think we'll see differences in particular are temperature and dissolved oxygen. So in cattail stands, you actually see lower water temperature because it's so shaded, right? These things are so tall. You tend to see a lower water temperature by a degree or two. May or may not be sort of biologically relevant for plants, but you might see differences in shading. I think we've always wanted to look at nutrients. So things like algae in these stands, or nitrogen and phosphorus, and if there's differences in cattail versus non-cattail stands. And that's something we haven't done yet, but would like to look at. So we'll be looking at those same water quality parameters in cattail and then also in removed stands.
Okay. A question about herbicide applications on cattail. Just somebody at their lake, they said the DNR has been treating for a few years and they're not really observing much of an impact of the herbicide applications. Can you maybe comment on that method for cattail treatment?
Yep, and I have to say I don't know a lot about the effectiveness of herbicide applications. I think about, you know, being a fish person, I think a lot about the effect in the aquatic environment. So we tend not to use that because it's pretty negative for larval fishes and especially amphibians, right? Tadpoles and frogs. They're just really sensitive to that stuff. So I actually don't know too much about the effectiveness of herbicide. I mean, it's easy to do, and it seems to be effective in some places, but it's just not. I don't have a lot of data for that, so I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Got a couple more questions, and real quick in the chat, someone asked Amy if you'd consider presenting your results at some point to Lake Association meetings.
Yes, we really want to do that. I think I would be really eager to do that. And we are, you know, in ramping up, we're just starting to get connected. So yeah, I would be happy if folks want to reach out to me or reach out to Meg, or, you know, I'm happy to present anywhere or have grad students present. I'm particularly interested in getting information out to the public.
Yep, and we do talks, either myself or the researchers to Lake Associations all the time. So like Amy said, shoot us an email.
Yep.
Okay, going back to the Q&A box here. Great job, thank you. Could you speak, let's see here. The question is, could you speak on at all to introducing new submergent and emergent plants into lakeshore areas that may not have a desirable established seed bank? Okay, I think the question is, what about cattail stands that have maybe been really established where that native seed bank is unlikely to rebound? What's the restoration potential there?
That's a really good question. So I know that in Voyagers, which of course you don't think of Voyagers as a place where a seed bank is depleted, but just as an example, the way they do their removals, and they've done a lot of different types of removal. They take that biomass, the cattail biomass, they spread it on shore, and then they reseed it actually with a native vegetation mix. So they allow the sort of decaying cattail to provide nutrients to that native seed mix. So I do think there is potential for removal and reseeding. People are just starting, I think, to look at that. And I do think it'll be interesting to look at some more southern sites. I think a next step of this would be to look at some southern sites and have an example of, when you remove cattail, is there really nothing? If there's nothing and only cattail growing back, then the next step would be to look at some sort of reseeding. But I think it's possible. I think reseeding with a native mix is what a lot of restoration folks do in wetlands, and I think it has possibilities for nearshore zones as well.
Okay. A question for someone who just had to step away while you were speaking.
Okay.
Just to clarify, this project is strictly going to be using mechanical methods.
Strictly mechanical methods, yep.
Okay. Okay. Question and comment from Derek. So many lakes in Minnesota are already heavily fragmented. Do you have concerns that lakeshore owners might use this information as justification to further fragment shorelines that are already having a lack of emergent vegetation or shoreline habitat?
Yes, I think that is a concern. And I think that's one of the things, we think of fragmentation, we think of always as fragmentation as bad, right? But when we're talking about really homogenized cattail stands, so something that's just cattail, that fragmentation might be a benefit. Now, you don't want the idea out there that, fragmenting any native habitat vegetation is good. So I think that's where this public outreach comes in. We're not talking about, let's just get rid of cattail. Let's focus on a mix of native plants, right? And specifically those growth forms that are really important. You need emergence, you need floating, you need submerged. So I think that without that public outreach component, there is a worry that people will take this and say, I'm just going to remove vegetation. And frankly, the Minnesota DNR is also concerned about that. They don't want to have to cope with a whole bunch of people thinking that fragmenting the lakeshore is a good idea without understanding that what we're doing is sort of removing this invasive cattail, restoring native vegetation for the benefit of fish communities. So I think focusing on a restoration component is important. So that's a really good point.
Well, I think another thing to think about is like how we think about fragmentation, what the word means, what the impact is. Like a dense monotypical stand of hybrid cattail or Phragmites is fragmenting the habitat. It can have the same physical effect as flat out removal of vegetation. Anyways.
Yep. Good point. Good point.
Question from Matt. With respect to the mechanical cutting, what's the required water depth to drown cattail?
It just has to be below the water. And it has to be below the water long enough, right? The stem, so that it drowns, right? So there's some concern about, in Voyagers, there's some water level variation. So we timed the cutting to make sure that those stems will be below water long enough. So it just really needs to be below the water to sort of drown that individual stem. And again, it's not gonna kill all the cattail around it, but it does open up that area because it drowns that individual stem, as long as it's below water for a decent amount of time. I can't tell you how long, actually. That's a good question, but enough to drown it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I have a follow-up question to that. So with the different contractors carrying out the removals this fall, will they be using different mechanical implements? And is there a chance that the different tools employed will have a different outcome?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we wrestled with that a bit because I guess the conclusion we came to sort of wrestling with that question is, does it have to be the same everywhere? Is that not necessarily, because in reality, it's not going to be the same everywhere. What we want is the cattail cut below the water in whatever method that works, and the biomass removed. So we realized then we're going to have to, when we look at our comparisons, we're going to have to keep track of what was done. But ultimately, to make this applicable to real life, we will have to just use what use what is available. And there's a lot of site characteristics that dictate that as well. Can the boat get in? Is it kind of shallow? Do they need to actually get out and use a hand method for part of the channel, and they can use the boat for the rest of the channel? So there are going to be differences. And so we will be keeping track. And then, the comparison is the overall goal of, once the cattail is gone in whatever way it became gone, then we can compare what happens with the fish and plant community. But it's a good question. And we sort of defaulted to what's going to be the real life, what's going to happen in real life. And that's what we're going to do.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's good perspective. Okay. We have one more question in the Q&A. If people have any last minute questions, we still have a few minutes left, but I'll go to this question here. Okay, I understand that hybrid cattails tend to form bog-like mats that extend over water deeper than natives can tolerate. If that's correct, how is cutting below the water line feasible? I guess, how would the methods be adapted when you're dealing with potentially floating mats?
Yep, and that's a really good question, and we've wrestled with that a bit this summer. I would say the folks who have the most experience with these floating mats are the folks in Voyagers. There are different types of, as I said, I'm a fish biologist, so I'm learning a lot about cattail removal logistics. Those floating mats, they have sort of different cookie cutter machines that actually take that whole mat and remove it. So I think I would really like to think about next steps in this project, looking at that removal. So rather than cutting below the water, you'd actually be taking those chunks of mat, which has all the rhizomes in it, and removing it. Because if you think of the overall goal, if you keep your eye on the overall goal, which is to expose the seed bank, right, in the sediment, that what should be there, what has been there for many years, to sunlight, and get that to grow. So that would require actually cutting out that floating mat and removing it. And again, I think that's sort of the approach they're taking in Voyagers. We may have one or two sites up there where we'll have kind of, yes, cutting below the water in a rooted section, right, where the cattail's actually rooted into the sediment. There are some places that are a little bit of a hybrid, and what we've decided to do is take out those, if there's a little chunk of floating, we'll take it out, because the goal is to get the seed bank in the sediment exposed to the sunlight. So that's a really good question. And because floating mats are such a huge problem, I think it'll be a good next step. I do know there are some folks too up north looking at how to avoid, if you get rid of all this cattail, then you have you really need to deal with the biomass, because that can also, encourage floating mats, as you have all this biomass and it just gloms onto other cattail and becomes this big mess. So I think that's something we need to consider in the future for sure. Okay, I'll start with questions, and if you jump in with your video, I'll let you keep doing it. We were going to have Meg ask me questions. It's just a little easier. So I will start, and I don't know if I'm starting at the bottom of the top or the top here, but Matt asks, might the management process, mechanical removal, create negative impacts? For example, sediment, nutrient resuspension, nutrient loading from dead plant biomass, assuming that not everything is removed. Will these be weighed against potential benefits? Yes, good question. So there may be some potential for mechanical removal to stir up sediment. We are not removing sediment, so we're just cutting at the surface. If you have a boat in there with a mechanical cutter, you might get sort of incidental resuspension of sediment. That's definitely a possibility. One of the things about nutrient loading from dead biomass that's going to be important is to remove that out of we're not going to leave that right on shore. We're moving it away from the shoreline to prevent leaching of nutrients back into the lake from decaying cattail. So yes, that's something important to consider. Although one interesting component about that is in Voyagers, they have been taking that dead cattail biomass. They've been doing all kinds of different types of removal. They're taking that cattail biomass, they are spreading it on the shore, and then they're reseeding that on top of that cattail biomass with a native plant mix. The idea being that the nutrients from the cattail, the dead cattail litter, can actually support native plant regeneration. So I think there are some detriments that we have to be careful of, not stirring up too much sediment, not leaving that biomass there to leach nutrients back into the lake. But there's also some potential benefits too of using that biomass for reseeding. One other interesting thing to note about that is removing the biomass can be important because if you leave it there and it starts floating around, it can kind of glom onto these other floating cattail mats, and that can be a real problem and really boating hazard. So there's lots of aspects to consider there. So thanks, that was a good question. Let's see. Next question, is narrowleaf cattails native range Europe or Eastern North America? I've heard both. So this is a good question. I am not a genetics person and I'm mostly a fish biologist. My sense is that it's not Eastern North America, but it probably came in from there earliest, right, from Europe. So what I'm familiar with suggests that it probably came from Europe, starting in the East and has then spread slowly to the West. And it's been pretty slow, although, you know, we do have these massive stands of cattail, hybrid cattail now. And when you look at those stands, when the geneticists look at those stands, they're usually a mix of, you know, some sort of mix of hybrids. That's what we're typically finding. So I believe Europe is the original origin. Let's see. Hi.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Good. Okay. I'm so sorry about that. Zoom is just kind of freaking out and I didn't have any control. So
no worries.
Surprises. You pivoted well. So those are good questions. I guess I have a few. So we have 15 minutes.
Okay.
I'll maybe throw out a couple questions and if people want to add more. Amy, you had mentioned the link to carbon emissions from cattail. And I was wondering if you could tell us some more about that. I think hopefully the climate crisis is on everybody's mind. And if there's a link to AIS research and management, I'd like to know more.
Yeah, and so I need to, that is a research project that came out of the Great Lakes. And so I believe it's the floating mats and sort of there's a lot of decomposition that occurs there. So it maybe increases the methane production of these wetland areas because you get so much biomass and so much sort of decomposition, and then you've got the floating mats that are covering it all. So they do seem to see some increase in methane production with really highly invaded areas of cattail. So yeah, it is an interesting link between AIS and climate change.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. With the different removal methods, like how many different mechanical approaches do you expect might be employed out in the field? I know you're kind of at the whim of whatever the contractors are using and they have certain specifications, but I could see some maybe minute differences in the type of machinery they're using. How are you dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we did sort of wrestle with that, you know, because whether we could find one contractor to do everything or if we're going to have different contractors, you know, it really just depends on who's busy and who has time. We defaulted to, we would like it to be as real world as possible. So we're just going to make sure every contractor is ending up at the same place, which is a, you know, 10-meter or 30-foot wide swath where cattails cut underneath the water from shoreline to open water. The other difference will be not only the contractor you use and what gear they have, but also the site. You know, some sites might be shallow and they can use the boat for part of it, and they might have to go in and do some hand cutting, you know, near the shoreline. So whatever the method, we are keeping track of it, but ultimately it'll just be the goal of a similar removal at each site.
Okay, good to know. So if there's any other questions, be sure to throw them into the Q&A. Hopefully that is updating. I think Amy addressed the two.
It is, yeah. There's a few in there. Can you see them, or shall I just keep going?
I cannot. If there's new questions,
yep,
you could go for it.
I'll go. Yeah, I'll go for it. I'm doing okay. So let's say, I don't know if I'm starting from the top or the bottom. Okay, so did you say cutting the cattail will also kill it? In the photo with the people removing the cattails, they're using an AVG, aquatic vegetation groomer. Is the cutting of it as effective to kill it off as pulling it out entirely by the root or rhizome? So that's a good question. So when you cut it underwater, you're not killing the entire plant. You're kind of like drowning that stem. I would say, you know, if you have a really new invasion where you can actually get the whole clone, because remember what you're seeing in these cattail stands are a whole bunch of different clones because it's really lots of stems on the same plant. So even if you dig out a bunch of the rhizome, if you're not digging out all of the rhizome of that plant, it can still shoot up new growth. So I would say the only time you're really going to get a whole plant or a whole clone is if you have a new invasion and you can really see where that starts and ends. You know, there's all kinds of other issues with removing actual sediment and rhizomes. That's another permitting issue, and there's sediment resuspension there. So it doesn't kill the plant, it does kill the stem, and then that plant has to shoot another rhizome in there and a stem up, if that makes sense. A question, how will you account for differences in depth, even if only marginally different? That's a good question. We certainly are keeping track of depth at each minnow trap, because of course that's going to affect fish community. So at each minnow trap, we keep track of how deep it is, so we can look at depth as a covariate when we analyze all these data to see if that's what's causing the difference or not. And again, one thing that's important to note is that what the comparison we're really interested in is within lake, cattail remaining versus cattail removed, and we're going to try to make those depths as similar as possible. So we're not really, you know, looking at a whole different ecosystem, but that is a covariate we'll definitely have to keep track of. Let's see. Similar to Jeff's question, when selecting sites for cattail removal, what is the desired depth at the outer edge of the cattail fringe? We didn't really have a choice about that, right? We had to have, we needed, what we looked for mostly in selecting sites, and it was not easy for, and really this was what Brendan and Mike spent a big chunk of the summer doing, is try to find suitable sites. We just found sites where we could fit our minnow traps into the sampling. We didn't want to sample, minnow traps are not super effective beyond about 1 meter or 3 feet of depth of water. So we weren't looking for, we wanted a stand that had a good section that was within 1 meter of depth. And then we'll cut that out to the open water so that water can flow into those cut areas. So it wasn't really desired depth at the outside edge. It was more, what are the site characteristics through the whole site, and can we sample fish and plants in there? All right, I've got one more here. I live on a lake with invasive cattail and have over 200 feet of lakeshore with invasives. Even only 4 years ago, there were channels at the lakeshore that northern would span in the spring. Now the channels have undergone enough succession that there's never water in that shoreline. Have you considered cutting channels at shoreline? Would that increase spawning zones? Yeah, good question. So there's starting to be some research about cutting channels for spawning. And you know, I think we're starting with these rectangular channels as a first cut, right? A first way to look at it, because that's already occurring on the landscape when people get an aquatic plant management permit. But I think we did also think about turning those on their edge, right? And sort of doing a long cutting along the side. And I think that'll be something that's interesting to look at, especially if you're thinking about spawning. Perhaps that could increase spawning zones. Some folks have also looked at, sometimes you have an outer cattail sort of hybrid invasion, and then the inner marsh, there's a connection, but the inner marsh is still intact, or the inner zone is still intact with water. So sometimes people just cut a channel through that outer zone just so fish can get into that inner zone. So I think there's a lot of really interesting orientations that we can look at, and maybe for a next iteration of the project. Let's see. Do you think the use of channels, let's see, oh yeah, we still have 5 minutes. Do you think the use of channels by landowners, by boaters, affects the regrowth of native plants, especially floating wood plants, and may affect the impacts on fish? Yes, I think it does. I mean, you know, we've talked about this in terms of permitting, which of course is not something we have control over, but you know, if you're cutting a swath of emergent plants to put your boat in and you're using that regularly, you know, you may likely remove, just by use, other native plants that would be good for fish. On the other hand, if you're not using that boat all the time, maybe you can get some, you're maybe keeping those hybrid cattails out of there, but you're getting some submerged plant regrowth. You could also think of some creative solutions where, okay, you have this you know, permit for your boat to go in and out, where you're going to have repeated use, but maybe there's a habitat improvement permit that you could see where you're just cutting, not using it, trying to let the native vegetation regrow. So I do think boats probably affect native plant communities as well. I do think probably maybe less than that hybrid cattail. What sort of tools would a lakeshore owner use on a small scale for cattail cutting? Okay, this is a little bit beyond my expertise, but someone mentioned here there's, what I think of as like an underwater weed whacker, which I'm sure is not the right term, but you can buy underwater cutting tools, sort of handheld underwater cutting tools that can cut the cattail below the surface. There are also like pretty commonly available a hand cutting tool. It has a silver handle and it looks like a triangle and it has a blade on the end, and you can kind of just you pull it out into the water and pull it back in, and it's sharp and cuts cattails. I've seen people use that for small areas in their near their docks. But again, those are things you have to have aquatic plant management permits for to do that removal in your areas. And there's one more question here, which so is the seed of hybrid cattail viable? I believe so, but I don't know that for sure. That's actually a good question. And I will need to look that up. So that's a good question. My assumption is yes, but I actually don't know if that's fully correct. Oh, someone writes, aquatic vegetation groomer would be the underwater weed whacker term, should be able to Google. So Google under aquatic vegetation groomer. It's like, yeah, so it's like the kinder, gentler, like cutting tool. Let's see. I think that's it. There's something in the chat. Thank you. Oh, thanks for the compliments about the talk. I'm happy to have all the questions. It's really fun to answer questions. Oh, someone writes, raspberry cane cutters work well for cutting individual stalks underwater. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Amy, for a great talk and rolling with the punches when Zoom decided to throw us a wrench.
No problem.
Good adaptation. And thank you everybody for those good questions.